Good afternoon. I am Ogasaka from JST. I've gotten used to this community, and now I've gotten used to your jargons. Data Management Plan, DMP, is what I was asked to talk about this afternoon. We do have strategic basic research programs at JST for fiscal 2016. We have started the large-scale introduction of DMP in Japan. I believe that this is the very first case of DMP introduction, so I'm hoping that what I'll be talking this afternoon will be helpful to you. So, first, talking points. What we have been doing in terms of open science within JST, and then talk about the data management plan introduction within the framework of the strategic basic research programs. And time permitting, I'll be talking about the other initiatives as well. A very brief explanation of JST, known as the funding agency, but we have three functions. One is to serve as the think tank to do the planning and programming and setting the strategies. The second function is to promote the science and technology innovation. In other words, the funding function. In other words, we are promoting the R&D, the commercialization of R&D, promotion of internationalization, and promotion of various facilities. And the third is the infrastructure function. And the department that I belong to falls under this category as well. In other words, to set up the infrastructure for S&T, science and technology innovation. So in our activities, policy making and preparing documents are very important. In relation to open science, there is a report issued by the Cabinet Office and some of the plans by the Ministry of Education, mixed, as well as last year, there was the G7 Ministers' Conference on Science and Technology, as well as the Science and Technology Innovation Strategy of the government. So we have to take into consideration all these policy documents of the government on open science and open policy. So let me go over what we have been doing. Back in 2013, JST became the first funding institute in Japan to develop and announce the open access policy. The highlights are for the research activities to which we provided grant, we are to promote the open access. We made a clear declaration of that. We are recommending green OA, and also on gold OA, we will be permitting gold open access as well. In other words, the fund could be used for the gold OA as well. And then we are involved in our activities as the Japan Link Center starting in 2015, providing funds for the institutes that are involved. For those people and organizations that are interested in the research data sharing, we have provided the funds on the trial projects of registration of DOIs. And we have already published a report on that. And last year, we invited the RDA Plenary Meeting in Tokyo, and it was held in this building. In fact, 342 people participated. Large meeting. And Also, in 2016, we set up the Research Data Utilization Promotion Council. We invited lots of organizations and people to engage in discussions for the promotion of the research data utilization. So those are the activities that we are involved in at JST on the open access. And now let me talk about the main topic of the presentation today, which is the introduction of DMP. The government funds provided to basic research is not what we are involved in. So as a structure, we are to create the networks involving a number of researchers, have the leader, and to operate on the activities for specific research area. That is the basic characteristics of the strategic basic research programs. If you have this brochure, that brochure describes in detail of the strategic basic research programs. So, data management plan introduction. Historical backdrop. There was a big issue of the open data structure. There was a increasing momentum to promote this, and we felt that back in 2014, JST should be promoting this as well. And against such a backdrop, we decided to introduce DMP in the strategic basic research programs as well. So the first thing that we did was to do the survey of the stakeholders back in 2015, and then in February 2016, data management policy was set up. And what should be included in DMP are described there. The document itself has been distributed to you as the background material for those of you who are interested. And starting from phase 2 invitation in fiscal 2016, we made it mandatory that the results be made available in the open access manner. First, we surveyed the people who are involved in research activities because the data providers and users, we wanted to know what their experience has been in using these kinds of data sharing so that we can develop the policy that are truly helpful to the users and researchers. We carried out the web-based surveys, 769 people. We sent surveys to those people, and the response rate was about 30%. And there were several questions that we asked. Let me highlight 3 things. First, about the experience of using the data. And about 60% of the respondents said that they have used the data from someone else. And we asked what was the most effective data. And they said that 70% of the data that were effective were the publicly available data from the public research institutes or from academic scholarly associations. And the level of satisfaction was over 80%. And for the reasons for satisfaction, the most common answer was the reliability of data. And the second most common response was the ease of use. And so we've concluded that we should recommend the data to be registered onto the public database. And we also asked about the experience of providing data. About 50% of the respondents said that they have experience providing the data, and about 50% said that it worked, that it was successful. And the criteria for success, the evolution into joint research or evolution in the counterparts research activities. Those were considered to be the evidence of success. And there were some other responses as well. And based on these responses, we thought what was most important is we have to have a mechanism where the feedback from the users can be incorporated. So we need to identify the source and also to have the link between the data used and the papers on which the data were cited. And another result of those that have provided the data said that they provided data in response to the requests made on an individual basis, which in turn means that unless you have the individual relationship with the parties that have asked for the data, you would not be willing to share the information, which gets us back to point number one, that is, we should really promote the uploading of data on the public database. We also asked why they did not provide data to those people who did not provide data. The responses included there was no request, and the benefit to the provider was not clear, and the accountability was not clear, and also there was the copyright, the confidentiality concerns as well, which is not surprising. And the learning here is that it is important to let the younger researchers understand the need to provide data. So we would first focus on younger researchers, encourage them the DMP, which might be a very basic point. There are many other questions that we asked in our surveys, but based on the learnings, we put together the implementation policy. And from those, we have extracted the items that would be incorporated in policy, which is shown here in Japanese. And there are 6 items, and this implementation policy was announced about a year ago in February 2016. One is the policy on the archiving and management of the research data that are target of data. And the accumulated cloud application is encouraged. And number 2, to have policy on the publication and non-publication of the research data. And if the data is not going to be published, the reasons for not doing it should be explained. Now, if the JST does not specify the need, the requirement for the publishing, then it is up to each author, each researcher to decide. And policy number 3, if there are data that can be made public, the methods and the system for provision need to be clarified. And JST recommends the utilization of repositories developed by the public database providers or by the academic societies. And then there are 3 more. And these policies were put together in February 2016. During fiscal 2016, The invitation on Crust and Presto were conducted in 2 phases, and these policies were reflected from phase 2, and this is what it says in the invitation.
And it's on this yellow shaded portion. The research representative that was adopted for research area that was set newly in fiscal 2016, they have to submit a data management plan together with the research plan, and they have to implement archiving, management, and publishing of the data based on this policy. And as you may have noticed, unlike the policies from US or Europe, this has been required of the researchers that have been adopted or selected. And there is a reason for that. Usually, you would ask the people who apply for the grant would be required to come up with the data management plan, but that would mean that that would be part of the criteria for the screening. But actually, that is not so much emphasized in terms of screening for subsidies. In NSO and DOE, I have talked to the officials, and they said that it's difficult for them as an issue. And even if the management plan is submitted before selection, how much weight we should put and how we should evaluate that, there's no knowledge or information, insights that we can rely on. So at this moment, at least, this is not part of the screening criteria. But after the researchers were selected, they are asked to come forward with the plan together with the research plan. Now, the result of the phase 2 has been already out, and the researchers were selected, and 79 research projects are now eligible for the subsidies, and the number of data items that have been submitted is 227, and the breakdown is shown here. And the data contents are varied, including experiments data, computation data, or computation modules themselves. They are so varied. And with regard to publishing or non-publishing policy, the non-publishing or limited publishing and publishing, there are 3 different levels to choose from, and about half chose limited publishing, and the remaining is split between publishing and non-publishing on an evenly divided basis. With regard to archiving location, half of the researchers said that they would archive in the servers of their laboratories, and the remaining ones, excluding the 1/4, is their institution or university repository or external servers, which are very few, and 1/4 said they don't know, or they're still working it out. And well, this was not really up to our expectation, honestly speaking. Well, if I can share my thoughts of this result, is that as an overall trend, the limited publishing was half of the answers that we got for the range of publication. And if you take a look at the range, the limited audience for that publishing is mostly the research team or research areas. And there are 2 different classifications or categories for limited publishing. The first one is to explicitly specify who have the access to, and so it is a restrictive sharing. And the other is, in principle, they are made open, but with some exceptions. So that is restricted publishing instead of restrictive sharing. But at this moment, most of the researchers that said that they would give limited publishing have chosen restrictive sharing instead of restrictive publishing. But there are many cases actually that they said that they are willing to upgrade from non-publishing to limited publishing or limited publishing to publishing if there is a request. And another point is that assuming that there will be some use, data archiving should be done. That's not what they think, because it will cost them money to do data archiving or data reanalyzing. So rather than data reanalysis for other purposes, they would like to do the remeasurement of the data for a specific purpose that they already have. So based on those responses, we figured that we need to do more of explanation to those researchers in order to solicit more understanding. Now the DMP development has been going quite well because we didn't ask for excessive volume of plan to be established, and sometimes the JST has helped those researchers to come up with DMP. And with regard to the data management in line with the DMP, you need to also help them in terms of sharing or publishing decisions on this front. And there will be some tailwind that could come going forward. Now, let me talk about what JST thinks as other initiatives. The first one is about open access. There is an organization called CORE. I'm sure you all are aware of this. It is based in the US, and it is an alliance of publishers, and they have the initiative called Chorus. I'm not going to go into details, but JST, working with Chiba University and CORE, to figure out whether this would be viable in Japan, and there is a pilot program ongoing, and there will be result out soon. And if this is successful, then we may be able to do this in Japan. And open science, the trend, if this is increases, then from the perspective of interoperability, permanent identifier or persistent identifier rather is something that we need to consider. In the global PID system and domestic system, the interoperability between these two systems would be required sooner or later. So rather than talking about JST, but as Japan Link Center, this type of system would be probably required, and that's what we are now looking at. Last but not least, this is what we are now putting together. The open science policy for JST is what we are putting together. With regard to the articles or papers, we are reviewing the existing policies and trying to come up with a new one. And with regard to research data, we're looking at international and domestic policy trends, but also taking into account the acceptability on the part of the researchers. We would like to come up with realistic policies. With regard to DMP, we are trying to implement this in all programs, but there's a wide variety of programs ongoing in JST, but we have to be very realistic by taking into account the nature of each of the projects. So in the near future, we would like to come up with the unified approach and policy for JST. Thank you for your attention.
小笠原様。
Thank you very much, Mr. Ogasaka. If there are any questions, we'd like to entertain those. If you have any questions, please raise your hands. And please identify yourself and your affiliation first before you ask questions. And please be very concise in asking questions. I am Koga from Tenri University. I'd like to ask about the plan and policy that you mentioned. In order to assure persistence of data archiving To what extent are you going to take that into account, and the system base, and how to sustainably fund the program? Those are some of the perspectives that I would like to ask about in terms of persistent data archiving. There are two answers to that. Firstly, you have to archive data so that it won't get lost. And the other is to make the data retrievable and searchable. And for the former, as a national policy, the academic cloud promoted by NI will be promoted and proceeded. With regard to the latter, for the moment, the DOI that has been given, digital object identifier given to the paper, should be also applied to research data. And in many of the countries, that is how things are going. And that's what we have decided to do. And we believe that this is the direction that we're headed for. But if there's any additional comments that can complement my answer from the audience, I would welcome that. Any other questions? If not, do you have any questions? Nice step, Hayashi. The data management plan is going well. That's what you said, for the reason that you have provided the sample with you have provided for researchers with samples, and also the people from JST helped them put together the plans. So what sort of personnel got involved in the assistance? Because those could be one of the talent profile that will be needed for data management plan assistance. And since we're talking about SPARC Japan, if the librarians want to help them put together this management plan, what sort of profile do you need? In the PREST or in JST projects, the people who are responsible for those projects have looked at the research plan, and then they're talking about NMR. Maybe this would be the kind of data that you would see, and this research seems to be quite sensitive, so it could be a limited sharing. So they have come up with their own idea and to share that with the researcher and ask for their feedback. Some of our officers have done that. So why they have done it and they were able to do this? Basically, the people in JST were involved from the research area setting, and they come up with the program by looking at the contents, and the research plan that has been submitted were examined by them, and they were looking at this from a peer reviewer's perspective and engaged in exchange with researchers to see whether the research would be really viable. And as they were involved in that much, they are well versed in the research themselves, so they can come up with some data management plan. Maybe I should say this as well. There's no specific lecture that was given to those personnel to do this, but this was something that they were able to do on the job training basis. Thank you very much. I'm sure you have more questions, but in the interest of time, if you have any more questions, please write down the questions in your question sheet. Thank you very much. Please give Mr. Ogasaka a round of applause again.